My boss was the kind of man who could charm a boardroom with a smile, but behind those glass walls he was hiding something darker. At first, it was just small inconsistencies in the numbers, tiny details no one else seemed to notice. Then I realized millions of dollars in client funds were vanishing into special accounts, only to reappear in ways that didn't make sense. Every question I asked was brushed off with the same line, "Don't overthink it, Natalie." But I couldn't ignore the signs. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't business, it was a game. My boss had turned our company into his own personal casino, gambling with money that wasn't his and writing my name into the reports so I'd take the fall when the walls came crashing down. He thought I was blind, too ambitious, or too scared to fight back. What he didn't know was that I was already gathering evidence, step by step, preparing for the one moment that would change everything. And when that day finally came, I wasn't the pawn in his game anymore, I was the dealer. On my first day at Hawthorne Capital, Patrick shook my hand like he was closing a deal with destiny, warm palm, perfect cufflinks, cologne that smelled expensive and practiced, and told me he'd been watching my trajectory, which was a flattering way to say he'd skimmed my LinkedIn. He was the kind of boss who could turn a hallway into a stage, a confident tilt of the head for the partners, a conspiratorial wink for reception, a performance calibrated down to the half-smile. I was 26, a junior analyst with a scholarship chip still on my shoulder and a laptop that ran hotter than my imposter syndrome. The office looked like money felt, glass walls, quiet carpets, a view that made the city look obedient. My badge worked, my inbox exploded, and by 10 a.m. I had 3 models to fix, 2 calls to join, and 1 directive from Patrick that sounded casual but wasn't. Keep your eyes open, Natalie. We move faster than the market. It sounded like mentorship. It felt like a test. For a while, I wanted to pass. I studied his meetings through the glass, his hands cutting the air, the way clients leaned forward when he said downside protected. I sat in the back and learned the Hawthorne dialect, alpha, beta, carry, basis points, the holy trinity of trust, performance, discretion. But after a month the language started to itch. Patrick's decks were always immaculate, but the raw exports never matched the shine. Cash flow lines kinked, then straightened in the final slide. One-off timing differences, he'd say with a grin, and people nodded because the grin was convincing. The risk committee flagged a drawdown that shouldn't have been possible. A week later, a reconciliation appeared like a rabbit from a hat. I told myself it was just me catching up, that genius looks messy under a microscope. Then I noticed genius always favored Patrick. I keep a notebook with me the way some people carry lucky coins. At first it held ordinary things, DV01S, tickers, coffee preferences for partners I wanted on my side. Then I started writing other things, the kind you jot down because your future self might need to prove your current self wasn't paranoid. Fund 3 cash sweep missing $240K, Patrick says bank delay. Expense tag client relations equals jets? Vendor Bluefinch Consulting no website. Little splinters. They lodged under the skin of my day. When I asked for backup docs, Patrick's smile thinned a millimeter. You're thorough, he said, as if it were both a compliment and a warning. I told myself to relax. Hawthorne had lawyers who ate fraud for breakfast. If anything smelled off, they'd pounce, right? Except lawyers only pounce on what they're allowed to see. Patrick controlled what people saw. The compliance lead, May, was brilliant and tired. She color-coded her binders and apologized to printers when they jammed. When I hinted that some reconciliations felt decorative, she exhaled through her nose and said, softly, Patrick's very persuasive, which was not the same as Patrick's correct. The pivot from itch to certainty came on a Thursday when I was building a factor model for a mid-cap portfolio Patrick loved to brag about at dinners. The underlying trades were fine, the flows weren't. Money left client A's sub-account on Friday and reappeared in client C's on Monday with a fee attached that didn't match our schedule. The memo field called it a liquidity bridge, which is the kind of term you use when you need something to sound legitimate in a hurry. I traced the path and found a way station, a special account, with a name innocuous enough to slide past anyone who trusted labels. The balance dipped on Sunday at 2:11 a.m. Markets closed, lights off, into a retail platform no institutional shop should touch. I cross-referenced the timestamp. It lined up perfectly with Patrick's weekend strategy sessions, which were, apparently, conducted from a cabana with bottle service, if the geotagged photos of a partner's Instagram were to be believed. If you've never felt the moment a model stops being numbers and starts being a confession, it's like hearing a wall breathe. Everything around you looks the same, but your brain is different now. I printed the flows, highlighted the bridge, and walked to Patrick's office because I wanted to be wrong. Timing quirk, he said, not looking up. Client approvals. He tapped his screen. There's a memo. There was. He had written it himself. It explained nothing with impressive confidence. When I didn't move, he looked up and the air between us chilled a degree. Natalie, he said, all teeth, you're ambitious. Don't get lost in the weeds. I smiled, said thanks, and went back to my desk. Then I added a tab to my notebook, casino. From there, the tells multiplied. A vendor that existed only as a mailbox in Nevada paid 5 figures a month for research. A line item called entertainment with receipts from a nightclub that required security to whisper a password. A position that was hedged on paper but naked on the actual blotter, covered only when month-end screenshots were exported. Patrick's calendar blocked in gray 4 silent windows, during which wires moved in circles like dancers changing partners mid-song. He cultivated a myth that he could feel the market's pulse, that his gut beat faster a second before a move. The truth was smaller and uglier. He was plugging holes with other people's money and calling the bucket watertight. No one wants to believe a star is a mirror and a spotlight, not a sun. Clients shook his hand, partners laughed at his jokes, junior staff collected compliments like breadcrumbs. I started screening the noise. The words he used most in meetings, trust me, already handled, don't overthink, mapped perfectly to the documents he least wanted anyone to touch. It's tempting to picture myself as fearless here, the heroine who smelled smoke and ran toward it. I was scared. I paid off my student loans last year. Hawthorne was my first address that didn't wobble on a lease. My mother has a habit of reading worry out loud, like if she gives it breath it will leave her body and live somewhere else. I didn't tell her a word. I went to the gym too late and pretended the treadmill could outrun adrenaline. I dated a man for 3 weeks and canceled on week 4 because he asked what I did all day and I didn't have a version that fit into appetizers. I told myself to sleep. The numbers in my head stayed awake, tapping on the inside of my skull. The moment I stopped being scared of the truth and started being scared of silence came after the Q2 investor letter. Patrick rewrote my section, adjusted drawdowns into transitory softness, and inflated a recovery that existed only if you started the chart on a Tuesday. I pushed back. He leaned against my desk, close enough that I could count the threads in his tie, and said, "Choose your battles, Natalie." I did. I chose this one. But battles won in daylight require armies. The ones you win alone begin at night. So I started staying late enough to walk the empty hallways and learn where the building creaked. I learned which printers defaulted to secure release and which spit out anything you sent them if you knew the right driver. I learned that Patrick left his office at 7:12 p.m. most nights to take a call by the elevators where the cameras didn't cover sound. I learned that this special account sometimes received wires labeled top up minutes after his calls ended. And one night, when the cleaning crew rattled their cart past my cube, I learned that Patrick's laptop lock screen was a photo of a roulette wheel, centered, crisp, the ball about to drop. I stared at it for too long, long enough that the motion sensor lights timed out and threw me into momentary darkness. When they flicked back on, I was still there, hand on the back of his chair, thinking, a man will always tell you who he is. He just prefers you don't listen. I didn't yet have proof enough to burn the building down. But I had heat and direction and a promise I made myself quietly in the reflection of a glass wall. If Patrick had turned Hawthorne into a casino, he was about to learn what happens when the house stops letting him win. The discovery didn't arrive as a single smoking gun, but as a slow avalanche of clues that piled too high to ignore. each one heavier than the last until they threatened to crush me if I didn't start stacking them into order. It began on a Tuesday night when I stayed late to finish a sensitivity analysis for a client deck Patrick was presenting the next morning. The office had that echo it gets after dark, printers cooling, HVAC humming, the city outside blinking like an indifferent constellation. Patrick had left hours earlier, his chair still skewed at an angle like a throne abandoned mid-feast. His laptop was open, screensaver glowing, and for reasons I still pretend were noble curiosity instead of self-preservation, I nudged the mouse. No password. Just a desktop cluttered with folders, Q3 draft, VIP clients, bridge notes. My pulse skipped, my throat dry as chalk. I clicked bridge notes. Inside, spreadsheets. Not just any spreadsheets, but ones marked draft cover and client mask. And there, in columns too neat to be accidental, were transfers that matched none of our official reports. Client funds moving into accounts called HL Special, Westbridge Ops, Pat Holdings. Dates, amounts, transaction IDs. I stared until the numbers blurred, my mind grasping at the absurdity. He was using client money like chips in a casino, shuffling it between shells, hiding losses, gambling on positions that never appeared in official ledgers. And the kicker? In the corner of the sheet, under notes, my initials N.R., scribbled like a tattoo of blame waiting for the day he needed a scapegoat. I copied everything onto a flash drive, each click loud as a gunshot, and shoved it into my bag before the guilt could stop me. The next morning, Patrick sauntered in with his sunglasses still on, humming, and clapped my shoulder like we were teammates instead of prey and predator. "Natalie, you're a star," he said, tossing me a pastry bag from the cafe downstairs. I smiled, thanked him, and wondered if he knew I'd seen behind the curtain. He didn't. That was his flaw. He believed too much in his own performance. He thought charm was armor. He thought silence from others meant safety, when really it was calculation. From that day, I learned to wear my own mask. The evidence mounted faster than I expected. Patrick left his office one afternoon for a client lunch, and an email popped up on the shared inbox he'd accidentally synced to my Outlook. Subject: Vegas recap. My finger hovered, then clicked. Attached was a PDF of receipts, high-stakes tables, bottle service, penthouse suites. Paid on a card that, according to our system, belonged to Bluefinch Consulting, one of those shell vendors I'd already flagged. He wasn't just gambling with client funds in the market, he was literally gambling them in casinos, the metaphor too on the nose to be real if I hadn't been staring at the proof. I forwarded it to my private email, deleted the trace, and sat there with my heart pounding so loud I thought May, from compliance, might hear it through the wall. That night I met her for coffee under the guise of mentorship. I dropped a vague hint about off-book expenses, watching her face carefully. She didn't deny it. She just stirred her latte slowly and said, "Patrick knows how to keep people looking in the wrong direction." Her eyes met mine for a second, sharper than I'd ever seen them. That was enough. I wasn't crazy. Weeks turned into a quiet war of collection. I started recording my screen whenever I accessed financial files, saving encrypted backups on a drive hidden in the lining of my bag. Every unusual wire transfer, every expense that screamed fraud, went into a growing dossier I labeled simply insurance. At night, I'd spread the papers on my kitchen table, highlight patterns, draw arrows like I was mapping a crime scene. I barely slept, my dreams filled with roulette wheels and Patrick's voice telling me not to overthink. The paranoia was exhausting, but the clarity was addictive. Every document I gathered turned fear into purpose. Then came the moment that burned away any lingering doubt. Patrick called me into his office, shut the glass door, and slid a draft investor report across the desk. "I need you to sign off," he said casually. I skimmed it and felt my blood freeze. Losses had been erased, gains inflated, risk hedges fabricated. And at the bottom, next to "prepared by," was my name already typed in. My pen hovered over the paper as my brain raced. This was it, the setup. He was positioning me as the fall girl. If the house of cards collapsed, the reports would say I'd built it. I set the pen down and smiled. "Of course, Patrick," I said, my voice steady. though my stomach churned. Just let me run a quick cross-check on the data to be thorough. He beamed. That's why I trust you. He had no idea. That night, I called Grandma's attorney. No, not Grandma. That was Samantha's story. I called a contact I'd made during grad school, a forensic accountant who owed me a favor. I sent her a sanitized version of the documents, asking if the flows could be legal. Her reply came within hours. If this is real, Natalie, it's fraud. Big fraud. Protect yourself. I stared at those words until they imprinted on my eyelids. Protect yourself. From then on, every smile I gave Patrick was an act of survival. Every nod was a promise I'd break. He thought he was clever, weaving me into his scheme, making me complicit by default. What he didn't know was that I already had the receipts, the recordings, the dossier fat enough to bury him. And as I walked out of the office that Friday evening, the city glowing gold and steel around me, I whispered to myself the truth I could finally admit. Patrick hadn't just turned Hawthorne Capital into his casino. He had dealt me the winning hand without realizing it. And when the time came, I wasn't going to fold. I was going to call his bluff and watch him lose everything. From the moment I realized Patrick had typed my name at the bottom of those fake reports, my world shifted from fear to strategy. I stopped asking myself if I was paranoid and started asking how I could turn his arrogance into my weapon. He thought he was clever, grooming me into the role of scapegoat, but he didn't understand that paranoia is a survival skill in finance. Every late night I stayed in the office wasn't just overtime, it was reconnaissance. I learned when he left his laptop unlocked, when the compliance servers refreshed, when the cleaning crew looked the other way. I started keeping 2 notebooks, the professional one with neat bullet points for meetings, and the private one, scrawled with arrows and dates, mapping Patrick's fraud like a spider web. Each arrow pointed back to him. Each circle of lies overlapped until it became clear his empire was smoke, and I was gathering the fans to blow it away. I also knew I couldn't do it alone. May from compliance was the obvious ally. She was tired of Patrick's games, though too cautious to say it outright. Over coffee one morning, I slid a redacted flow sheet across the table, the kind that showed money vanishing into this special account and reappearing at a casino vendor. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. "You need to be careful," she whispered, glancing around the cafe like Patrick could appear in the foam of her latte. But when she handed the sheet back, her fingers lingered for a second too long. That was all I needed. She didn't deny it. She didn't tell me to stop. She was waiting for someone to make the first move. The hardest part was pretending. Patrick strutted through the office like a king, tossing compliments my way in front of others. "Natalie's a rising star. Natalie runs the numbers tighter than anyone." It was theater, positioning me for the fall. I learned to smile back, to accept the praise, to even thank him. But inside, every word was a match on dry tinder. I began to record things, not just documents, but conversations. Whenever he explained why a certain report didn't need to go to the auditors, I left my phone face down and recording. Whenever he bragged to colleagues about beating the market with impossible timing, I noted the exact phrasing. Slowly, I built a dossier that was less about suspicion and more about fact. The final piece was timing. Patrick's ego demanded a stage, and the perfect stage was the quarterly board meeting. He loved those days. He'd walk in with glossy slides, dazzling the directors with his charm, while the rest of us sat quiet. I decided that would be the day he unraveled. But to pull it off, I needed more than just numbers on a page. I needed undeniable proof. That's when I installed a screen recorder on my work machine, quietly saving every session where I accessed his hidden files. I mirrored them to an encrypted drive at home. Every transfer, every liquidity bridge, every fake vendor, all neatly packaged with timestamps. Then, almost by accident, came the ace. One night Patrick forgot to mute his line on a late call. I was on the other end, working a model, when I heard him laugh to someone about moving client funds to cover last weekend's loss and adding, "Don't worry, I've got Natalie cleaning the numbers. She doesn't even know." He had no idea I was listening and recording. His voice, smug and certain, was now my strongest weapon. In the days leading up to the board meeting, I acted like nothing was wrong. I joined him on client calls, built the decks he would take credit for, even laughed at his bad jokes. But every night, I rehearsed my move. I practiced standing up, sliding the flash drive across the table, and saying the words out loud. Actually, Patrick, these are your trades. My stomach knotted every time, but the knot was no longer fear, it was anticipation. He thought he had me cornered, that I was too young, too eager, too scared to fight back. But what he didn't know is that I had already stacked the deck. And when the board meeting came, I wasn't going to fold. I was going to flip the table and let his own cards bury him. The morning of the board meeting, the city looked sharper, the air thinner, like the world itself knew something was about to break. I dressed carefully, charcoal blazer, pale blouse, hair pulled back, professional but unshakable. Patrick strutted into the office in a tailored navy suit with a pocket square so loud it screamed arrogance, greeting people like a man already celebrating his own victory. He slapped my shoulder on the way past. "Big day, Natalie," he said, smirking. "Don't get nervous." I smiled sweetly, the kind of smile he mistook for deference. Inside, my heart hammered with adrenaline, but it wasn't fear anymore, it was anticipation. In the boardroom, directors shuffled papers, the chairman cleared his throat, and Patrick launched into his performance. Slide after slide gleamed with manufactured triumph, record returns, minimized risk, unique strategies. He dropped my name casually, attaching it to charts I knew were falsified. "Natalie's department handled these flows exceptionally," he said, flashing that grin that always made people lean forward. My jaw clenched, but I kept my eyes steady on the screen. He was building the narrative where I was his shield, his alibi, his scapegoat. And when the questions started, when one director asked why some reconciliations didn't match the raw data, Patrick chuckled smoothly. "That's just timing," he said, then pivoted. "Natalie can confirm." All eyes turned to me. My pulse spiked, but I was ready. I stood slowly, sliding a small black flash drive from my folder, and placed it on the polished table with deliberate calm. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the room, "these aren't my trades. They're his." The silence was instant, thick, almost physical. The chairman raised an eyebrow. Patrick laughed nervously. "Natalie, what are you doing?" he said, trying to sound paternal. I clicked the remote, and the projector shifted from his doctored slides to my evidence. Raw spreadsheets, timestamped flows, the bridge notes folder. Gasps rippled through the room as I walked them through the transactions, one by one, showing client funds rerouted into special accounts, then disappearing into retail platforms and casino vendors. Patrick's face reddened, his smirk gone. "This is taken out of context," he barked, but I wasn't finished. I played the recording, his voice, clear as glass, bragging about moving client money to cover weekend losses and using my name to clean it up. The sound filled the boardroom like a verdict. When it ended, no one looked at him, they looked at me. Patrick tried to recover, slamming his palm on the table. "This is a witch hunt." She's twisting things, but May from compliance, sitting quietly in the corner, stood and held up a folder of her own. "I can corroborate her findings," she said firmly. "The reconciliations don't add up, and these documents prove it." The directors exchanged looks, a murmur swelling into outrage. One of them leaned forward. "Patrick, is this true?" He sputtered, sweat shining at his temples, eyes darting like a trapped animal. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. For months he had made me the fool, the pawn. Now he was the one cornered, flailing in front of an audience he used to control. The chairman's gavel hit the table. "Effective immediately, Patrick, you are suspended pending investigation. Security will escort you from the building." The room buzzed with shock as Patrick staggered back, his mask in shreds. He glared at me, eyes burning with disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend how his apprentice had dismantled his empire. I didn't flinch. I met his gaze and said quietly enough that only he could hear, "The house always wins. And you forgot who owns the house." Security appeared at the door, guiding him out as his protests echoed down the hall. For the first time, the boardroom didn't feel like his stage, it felt like mine. The directors turned back to me, some nodding, some simply stunned, but all of them seeing me clearly for the first time. My hands trembled under the table, but my voice stayed steady as I added, "This company deserves better than a casino. It deserves trust. And starting today, that's exactly what it's going to get." When the boardroom doors closed behind Patrick and the echoes of his protests faded, the silence that followed was heavier than any applause could have been. For the first time in months, I let my lungs fill all the way, the air tasting like freedom and risk in equal measure. The directors sat stiffly, some exchanging cautious glances, others staring at me as though I'd just rewritten the rules of gravity. I wasn't naive. I knew what came next wouldn't be a coronation but a crucible. Patrick hadn't just been a boss, he was a shield, a scapegoat, a charming illusion that made clients and directors believe Hawthorne Capital was bulletproof. Pulling off the mask meant exposing the rot, and rot always stinks before it's cleaned. The chairman finally spoke. "Natalie, what you've done today may have saved this firm," he said, voice low but steady. "But it will take more than evidence to rebuild trust. Are you prepared for that?" My pulse steadied as I answered, "Yes." Because this company doesn't need another Patrick. It needs the truth. The days that followed were chaos wrapped in procedure. Auditors descended, combing through every file. Compliance set up war rooms with binders stacked like barricades. Reporters circled outside the building, hungry for a scandal headline. And me? I was in the center of it all, not as the scapegoat Patrick intended, but as the reluctant face of reform. I spent nights drafting letters to clients, assuring them their money was safe, backing every word with receipts. I stood in conference rooms walking investors through the evidence, not sugarcoating but not apologizing either. Some yelled, some threatened to pull funds, but more than a few stayed because for the first time, someone wasn't spinning. They believed me because I didn't ask them to believe in miracles, just math. And math, unlike Patrick's charm, doesn't lie. Inside the firm, the culture shifted like a tide. The fear that once filled the air, the fear of crossing Patrick, of questioning his numbers, began to evaporate. Analysts who used to keep their heads down started raising red flags without worrying about retaliation. May, no longer the weary compliance officer, became my closest ally, her sharp eyes catching details even I missed. Together we built a system that didn't just patch holes, but replaced the bucket entirely. Real transparency, double approvals, a whistleblower line that didn't funnel back to Patrick's inbox. The work was grueling, and there were nights I collapsed on my couch, wine glass untouched, wondering if I'd traded one kind of prison for another. But every time I walked past Patrick's old office, now stripped bare, his framed motivational quotes gone, I remembered the roulette wheel screensaver and felt the burn of vindication. Patrick didn't disappear quietly. He tried to claw back control with legal threats, painting himself as the victim of an ambitious subordinate. But the evidence was ironclad. The regulators launched an investigation, and with every subpoena, his story unraveled. The news broke within weeks. Star trader exposed in client funds scandal. His face was splashed across the business pages, the smirk replaced by a mugshot's hollow stare. Lydia, the mistress who used to strut into our lobby in designer heels, vanished from the narrative as quickly as she'd entered. The empire Patrick built on smoke and mirrors was gone, and all that remained was the wreckage and the question of who would rebuild. The answer came faster than I expected. One evening, the chairman called me into his office. He was an old-school man, his tie perpetually crooked, his tone always measured. "The board has decided," he said simply, sliding an envelope across the desk. Inside, a promotion letter, interim director of risk management. My hands trembled as I held it, not from fear but from the weight of what it meant. I had gone from being Patrick's pawn to inheriting the very role he once wielded like a weapon. "You've earned this," the chairman added. "Now prove us right." I nodded, unable to find words, but inside, a voice whispered what I couldn't say out loud. "Patrick, you tried to turn me into your shield. Instead, I became your replacement." The first day I walked into that office, my office now, I stood at the window overlooking the city. The glass reflected a woman I almost didn't recognize, steadier, sharper, forged in fire. I thought about the months of silence, the paranoia, the notebook labeled Casino. I thought about the moment I pressed play on that recording, the look on Patrick's face when his own voice condemned him. And then I thought about the future, not his, but mine. Hawthorne Capital wasn't perfect, but it was no longer a casino. It was a place I had saved, piece by piece, from burning to the ground. As I locked the door that night, the office empty, I whispered to myself a promise. Never again would I let someone gamble with other people's trust while I sat silent. Never again would I mistake charm for truth. Patrick had played the game like a king, convinced he couldn't lose. But in the end, it wasn't his casino anymore. It was mine. And unlike him, I understood the one rule every gambler forgets. The house doesn't always win, but when it does, it never forgets.